Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first in a new podcast series from Global Policy and the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. In this series, we're going to be discussing the work of academics in Durham University. And to kick us off, I have three guests. We have Jutta Bakonyi, a professor in development and conflict at Durham University. Peter Chonka, a senior lecturer in global digital cultures at King's College London, and Andrew Maina, solutions coordinator at the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, which is currently working in Kenya's forced displacement space. Joining myself, Tom Kirk, Global Policy's online editor, we're going to be talking about the new book written by Jutta and Peter entitled Precarious Urbanism, Displacement, Belonging, and the Reconstruction of Somali Cities. We're going to get into the book's themes and the findings of the research and their implications for different types of audiences or readers. But just to briefly say, the book focuses mainly on the relationship between war, displacement, and city making, and it highlights how displaced populations are playing an active role in transforming urban spaces. So now I'd like to hand over to my participants. Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining us on this very first of our new podcast series. Can each of you just say a little bit more about who you are and some of your research interests, and then we'll refocus and get into the meat of the book.
Yeah, my name is Jutta Bakonyi. I'm professor in development and conflict, and my main research is on violence. I study violent conflicts, wars in the context of state decay since a few decades, and always have an empirical focus on the Horn of Africa. A little bit more recently, I refocused and study infrastructures. I look in ports and how ports shift political relations or the role they play in political relations, but I also look in roads and transport corridors.
Thank you. And can I come to Andrew, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Tom. My name is Andrew Maina, Durable Solutions Coordinator with the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, and our work is focused on supporting NGOs, governments, and other aid actors formulate policies and programs relevant to durable solutions. And I'll be happy to speak more about our work.
Thanks. And last but not least, Pete.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, Pete from King's College London here. I'm a researcher that's been focused on the Horn of Africa and the Somali speaking parts of the Horn of Africa for quite a long time. In general, my work looks at the implications of technological transformations, digital transformations on dynamics, politics, mobility, society, culture in so-called fragile states. That's what I do.
Thanks a lot, Pete. I want to kick us off by talking a little bit about the book and exploring some of its main themes. So, Pete and Jutta, can you tell us what's the book about?
So when we wrote the book, it was a time when nearly 120 million people worldwide were forced to leave their homes. They were forced to flee. The reasons for this were mainly climate-induced shocks, droughts, floods, increasingly also wildfires, and or violent conflicts and wars. Now, importantly, 2/3 of the people who are forced to flee, that's around 80 million, remained within a state boundary. So they became what is officially known as internally displaced people or IDPs. And again, most of these IDPs, internally displaced people, flee to cities. In this way, they contribute to the rapid urban growth we can observe in many countries in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East.
Yeah, and so in this context, Jutta and I have both worked in the Horn of Africa for quite a while, and this is a part of the world where there are extremely high rates of this type of displacement. So it's an important context that we decided to conduct the research into, using interviews and participatory photography as methods. We tried to do this research from the perspective of those people who've had to flee and settled in cities. And so we're trying to understand the experiences of people moving and finding a home in these rapidly urbanizing cities, 4 different cities in Somaliland. And yeah, the book is about the relationship between these types of displacement and city growth from the perspectives of those people.
And Andrew, yourself, you're the practitioner in the room. You work both on displacement and urbanisation. But can you tell us a little bit more about what your organisation, the Regional Durable Solutions Secretariat, actually does?
Yes, thanks, Tom. So the Secretariat is a regional platform initially formed by 14 non-governmental organizations, aid actors essentially, keen on developing people-centered, politically sensitive, and socially economic viable program and policy responses to internal displacement. And it covers 10 countries within the East Horn and Great Lakes region. So countries such as Burundi, Tanzania, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia. And one of the things that we really advocate on is more of a people-centered approach that is quite sensitive to power relations, either promote solutions for displaced populations or exclude them. So looking at what produces marginalization and how to address that, the underlying factors around, these political incentives that tend to keep people in precarious conditions and how to address that as well. And also looking at the wider resource availability that provides opportunities for IDPs to be able to become self-sufficient. Yeah, so that, in a nutshell, is the focus of our work here at RISE.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. Now, writing a book's a huge undertaking, especially if you're researchers. I understand that there's going to be a lot of findings coming out of that. But if you can, just for our readers, can you talk about some of those main findings or some of the main trends or themes or things that you think the book discovered through this research process and the writing?
I would suggest that we focus here on two major findings. I think we have more, but let's focus. And the first finding is about what we in the book conceptualize as camp urbanization. Through our research, we understand it as a very particular way in which cities grow through the unplanned establishment of camp-like settlements. Such camps or settlements composed of huts are built on unused places in the cities, but also and more so at the outer edge of cities. So where the city goes over in the countryside, people establish their huts. You cannot just establish a camp like that in the cities we study. They are embedded in a political economy. And this economy is composed of four main actors. First are, of course, the owners of this land. The second actor group is the people who migrate to the city and want to find a place to settle. So they have to get in contact with these landowners. And that's when a third group emerges. That's what we call them petty entrepreneurs or humanitarian entrepreneurs. International organizations often call them gatekeepers, people who establish themselves as intermediary in between the landowners and the people, the in-migrants who look for a place to settle. So these intermediaries, they negotiate with the landowners and get the permission for the establishment of the place. And then they mobilize in-migrants and say, establish your hut on this place. It's a good place. They don't do that just for free. And this is where the fourth actor group comes in, that is humanitarian organizations. These gatekeepers also try to get the attention of humanitarian organizations to tell them, come, bring us things because here are people who suffer. And once they manage that, once humanitarian organizations come, and they usually come with deliveries in kind, that can be food, that can be blankets, that can be tents, that can be cooking oil or hygiene products. But increasingly, they also come with cash. So when these deliveries come, the intermediaries cut a good share of these deliveries and they share with the landowners. So both landowners and intermediaries, so to say, get a rent from this unused land. Another source of income is that humanitarian organizations, of course, also provide infrastructure. They start to establish toilets or water points, so what people need to survive. They also start to build schools or health centers. And from these contracts for the infrastructures, again, the landowners and the intermediary cut a share. So it is in this political economy that camp urbanization takes place.
Yeah, and I think what's crucial here is that this infrastructure that Jutta is talking about comes to connect these camps, these extremely flimsy, fragile camps to the wider city. And then, this infrastructure and aid that's accrued, the resources encourages other people to settle in camps. The city kind of encroaches into the camp, and all of this makes land prices increase. The labor that people have put into this increases the value of this land that's been cleared, that's connected to the city, even in some of these very precarious ways. And this is the point when camp inhabitants are likely to be displaced again, because of course, remember that these are people who have been displaced by often from the countryside, by conflict, ecological shocks, all of this stuff. People have been in large numbers, particularly around the time we were doing the research research for the book, people were being evicted in very, very large numbers from these camps because landowners see the potential for developing these plots that have been cleared further, and the landowners might develop the land themselves. They might sell it to other developers, and all of this is going on in the context of real estate booms in cities like Mogadishu, which are quite well documented. And this at this point, camp residents are now displaced and then have to move to another settlement, usually further beyond the outskirts of the city, and then in many ways the process can start again. So here, as Jutta was saying, there's a political economy being established here around property, the clearance of land, humanitarian aid that's coming in, that's being seen as a resource, displaced people that are seen as a resource in themselves. And this is unfolding through cycles of eviction and resettlement. But really, it's this kind of camp urbanization, this camp entrepreneurship by gatekeepers and the people who want to settle that is making new urban land accessible to investors. And that's one of the key points we wanted to get over: the displaced people as kind of active agents of urbanization, albeit very marginalized ones.
Let me then come to the second or other finding. This is, we criticize throughout the book the quite limited understanding of displacement as either singular event and not either or, but and as linear movement. So displacement is often imagined as a movement from place A to place B, a place of origin to a host place or a host community. You're displaced and then you settle. This view, however, does not at all capture the realities of displacement we found in the Horn of Africa. And more importantly, I think we show it results in classifications that can themselves have a detrimental effect on the lives of the people who are displaced. So let me clarify. Patterns of mobility are rarely linear, of displaced mobilities. People we interviewed were often forced into a mobile life that lasted not for days, not for weeks, but for years and sometimes even decades. Often interrupted by shorter or longer period of settlement, but then people forced to move again or moved themselves again. Many people we interviewed, and we interviewed over 160 people, they have experienced multiple forms of displacement as they were moving back and forth between the city and countryside. Some were crossing state boundaries, moving to neighboring countries, and then coming back. Some mainly moved within a district or even only within a city. But the mobile life of this urban poor and the cycle of evictions and resettlement we describe as camp urbanization is part of this mobile lifestyle that we want to emphasize, or we try to emphasize in the book. Not to recognize this displacement and the mobilities as this complex forms of movement, settlement, being mobile, settling down, moving from A to B to C and back, that leads to categorizations that we think are themselves problematic, such as the label IDP, against we push back throughout the book.
Yeah, just to add, in order to think about displacement and the complexity of these movements and the issues of these labels, we focus quite a lot on the history of displacement. And, we recognize the fact that, if you look at particularly post-state collapse Somalia, so Somalia since the late 1980s, early 1990s, a very, very large proportion of the population in Somalia has at some point been displaced by conflict and the kind of issues we're talking about. But in sort of local discourse and kind of the discourse of international aid actors, only certain people are known as IDPs, internally displaced people. And so these are the poor people, these are the marginalized people who've been forced to move. So there's a much larger proportion of people who've been displaced, but the IDP is a label used for certain people. So what's the role and the power of this label? Like, who do people imagine that it applies to? I mean, we hate the acronym. We hate using acronyms like IDP to talk about people who have these diverse experiences, and it has a particular power, right? And it means different things in different places, including within the research context that we were doing the work in, right? If you look at the discourse in Somaliland's sort of breakaway independent status means that people, if they've come from southern Somalia, they're not understood as being internally displaced. They are understood as being refugees, right? So there's a politics around this. And we found that, often it's very convenient for powerful actors to talk about IDPs as a shorthand for particular clan, ethnic or caste groups who are seen not to belong in particular places. where they've moved to. And it allows people to talk about those groups without having to use particular names of groups, clan names, caste names, etc., which is taboo in society. So we're looking at the power of this label, how people use it, including people who are affected by displacement themselves, in order to kind of position themselves, survive, and make sense of their situations, but then also how it becomes kind of an element of stigma and can contribute to the stigmatization of particular places which are associated with those populations.
Thank you both for introducing that book. I would like to turn to Andrew now as the practitioner working on these issues on a day-to-day basis. Andrew, I've got two questions for you. The first is, what's your view on the book's findings and its label? It's picking apart an exploration of these labels that are being used in Somalia for the urban immigration and displacement. How do you see these labels, and what do you think about the book's dissection of them?
I think it's a point for reflection given how international aid actors operate in a place like Somalia. A lot of the aid actors gain their authority or legitimacy from international legal instruments. And in this case, we are looking at the guiding principles on internal displacement, which is a global one developed by the UN. And then there was a more regional one that is legally binding in the form of the Kampala Convention that is attached to the human rights legal documents within the African Union member states. If you look at the definition of internally displaced persons, they are more formal and they are more specific to movement. So the idea is that specific category of citizens, because they don't move outside international recognized borders, with the caveat with places like Somaliland, it's a bit dicey given how Somaliland views itself vis-a-vis the rest South Central Somalia. And the idea is that once somebody moves from point A to point B as a result of conflict, violence, human rights violation, drought, floods, and so on, then that person, by that fact of movement, becomes an IDP. And therefore, the way resources are mobilized, particularly at the onset, particularly among humanitarian actors, is based on this understanding that as long as you move from an area of origin because of drought, floods, and so on, then you become an IDP in this new location. However, I think the insights from the book further clarifies that there is nuance to that term. Oftentimes, those that displace from rural areas into the urban areas, not all of them would essentially move into a camp because of how the clan dynamics and the legacy of the war, in which the clan became the sort of predominant or preeminent protector of social, political, and economic rights. And therefore, if you move from the rural area and move to the urban areas and you find a huge population of your clan members who are quite active and quite powerful, then it is unlikely you're going to lack anything. Whereas if you are in the out group and you are an in-migrant, you don't have the relevant clan connections, then it is highly likely you're going to really struggle to make ends meet. So I think one of the key reflections, particularly on that labeling element, is essential to reflect on what do we mean by displacement. Of course, there are a lot of words that have been thrown down out there. People are moving away from displacement to framing it against displacement-related vulnerabilities, and it is tied to a specific set of rights in migrants, or what the international aid actors would call IDPs, need to have access to. However, I think that is not the full story. The whole idea here is, again, and this is the point that the book makes around this element around precarity. To what degree does access to these rights or access to these resources allow in-migrants to sort of regain their autonomy or agency? And given the fact that a lot of what we do and so on is tied to some sort of economic status or market-based status, it means what sort of resources in terms of opportunities and ability for these in-migrants to be able to meet their essential needs in a sustainable manner and with dignity. And I think this is the place the book pushes a keen reader and a keen observer of Somali displacement situation towards, and this is the place where we are moving a lot of our members thinking towards. Yeah.
I just want to acknowledge this Kampala Convention and the Convention of IDPs, which I think are very useful legal instruments. We don't want to push back against those. What we want to show is what happens when these legal categories hit the ground, so to say. What happens when they are applied into practice. And it's never as clear-cut as the legal text. And so what we try to show is how they are actually filled with power and shape relationships.
Okay, thanks for that, guys. And Andrew, as a practitioner, what do you think, or what would you say the use of research of this sort is for organisations that want to improve the lives of the in-migrants?
Well, I think this research, in addition to supporting actors to reflect on what displacement means, because then once we clearly identify or describe something, it is a bit easier to sort of develop interventions to it. I think on the political economy analysis side, there are two things. One, the book has to reflect on the opportunities and risks involved in the delivery of assistance to these in-migrants in these locations. And then number two, it helps us to formulate more politically sensitive and locally relevant stakeholder engagement approaches. So if I can start on the first one, on the opportunities and risks, I think given the fact that the entire logic is in a particular location, there is a camp and IDPs are in that camp as understood by the different global and regional documents, without really understanding what are the underlying factors, understanding what this label means and how this label is used to exclude certain individuals, certain people from accessing resources, then we are likely to create more harm than good. And I think the whole idea for us is to move interventions, or at least influence interventions, engaging in the technical response, be it sanitation, be it housing, and so on. They also take a clear lens on what opportunities and risks exist. So, for instance, in the opportunities, if we understand the incentive structures of landowners, entrepreneurs, or gatekeepers, and we understand that for them it's about accessing rent, accessing money, how then can we also support the in-migrants to acquire certain resources that can be useful to the landowner? So, for instance, shared tenancy. A lot of these in-migrants that are coming from rural areas have good farming skills. That what happens in most cases is that the people who own that land, the dominant clan groups that own that land, are more or less pastoralists. So then, farming is not considered as a noble profession in a place like Somalia. However, everyone needs to eat. That food has to come from somewhere. So if we better understand how we can resource in migrants that are in a weaker position to be able to address that, then I think we're in a better place to improve their lives.
Thanks, Andrew. It's really useful. And it makes me kind of want to ask Pete and Jutta a follow-up question in a way. We've been getting Andrew's views on what the book implies for practitioners, but can you tell us a little bit about the different audiences you wrote this book for and what you want them to take away from it?
I mean, beyond academia, we're interested in speaking to the people who work in these spaces, right? Who are linked to the funders who are involved in funding the humanitarian activity that goes on, that provides resources and kind of fuels this political economy. And we really think that many people who work in this space, particularly if they're new to the context as well, do need a better understanding of some of the ambiguities of the relationships that exist between so-called gatekeepers and those people who are settling in camps, because this kind of discourse around aid diversion is quite complicated and ambiguous, and people often who were settling in the camps often accepted giving away a share of the aid that they received as the price of settling and living in a camp, essentially for free. They accepted this as a form of rent that they had to pay. Now, sometimes this process is violent and exploitative on the part of gatekeepers. That certainly happens, but in other times it's more complex. And these are the kind of nuances that need to be understood by humanitarian donors, because what we do see, and what we have seen quite recently, is the pulling the plug on aid programs going into Somalia because of these discussions around aid diversion. And so, I mean, in that kind of space, we also need to engage more with the role of state actors, Somali state actors, many of whom are becoming more involved in these processes, probably more so now than a few years ago when we were doing the original research for this book. Because whether this sort of privatized political economy of camp entrepreneurship will continue or evolve or change, all of this is going to depend on the capacity that a state has in Somalia to provide basic services and to kind of engage in the kind of projects that Andrew was talking about previously. So, at the national level, we see kind of recent major international debt relief for the federal government of Somalia. There's another kind of change coming in terms of the African Union troop mission in Somalia that's going to impact the security environment. And, although there's still the war going on in Somalia between those actors and Al-Shabaab, I think, the coming year is is going to be crucial for sort of the trajectory of state reconstruction. And we hope that the book speaks to kind of the audiences who are interested in that, thinking about how those national developments impact on the kind of micro level patterns of urbanisation and camp urbanisation.
Yeah, maybe one other aspect to highlight is just that we also have an audience and a wider academic community, of course. There is a lot of research now on displacement, of mobility studies. And I think we share with them their concerns that all our research, including the political responses or policy responses, have this sedentary view on people's lives. So as we look in displacement, the solution to displacement is always settlement. So make people sedentary again, make them settle again, stop mobility. And I think, of course, it is a solution to settle people who are forced to flee. But having observed what happens in Somalia, we can clearly see that for many, mobility is actually not a problem, but a solution to a problem, to a much wider problem, to a much more structural problem, which settlement alone definitely cannot solve. And I think there is a whole range of studies now out there from different countries that actually shows how people who are mobile are actually acting on something in an attempt on a problem or a challenge in an attempt to change this challenge. So mobility is not the problem that underlies it. It's a reaction, it's an answer to a problem for the better or the worse.
It's great to be in dialogue with people like Andrew, and great to hear, kind of innovative thinking around things like Andrew was just talking about, shared tenancy, different ways of conceptualizing complexities in mobility. And so, yeah, hopefully we can continue that dialogue.
Thank you. That's a great place to end because it captures actually what global policy tries to do. We try and be a platform in some ways to have a dialogue between practitioners and academics with a view to impacting or changing or shaping policy and practice as it plays out in places like Somalia and elsewhere. So thank you very much for joining us for this first Global Policy podcast. It was a fascinating insight into your research, your book, Andrew's views as a practitioner, the meeting in the middle of all of those. And I really appreciate you guys taking the time. So from Global Policy, thank you very much.